The scent of lavender and cedar clung to the pillowcase, a quiet reminder of the herbs tucked away just days earlier. Lying completely on one side was the only manageable position, as resting flat on the back brought an agonizing reminder of a physical boundary that felt violently breached, like fabric tearing apart under immense strain without anyone knowing how to repair it. The steady rhythm of the hallway clock filled the space, punctuated only by a horse shifting weight in the barn below, its hoof striking the wooden boards with a clarity that seemed to eclipse the sound of human breathing. The morning light filtered through the curtains in a muted, chilly gray shade, typical of late October, when the frost clings stubbornly to the ground. Beside me lay the young man from the neighboring farm, someone who still felt more like a childhood acquaintance than a spouse, resting on his side with his back turned, his shoulders trembling in that distinct, heavy manner of someone desperately trying and failing to stifle tears. Any attempt to sit upright proved futile, as my lower body simply refused to support my weight, collapsing under multiple efforts. At 18 years old, and having been wed for a mere 14 hours, I was facing a reality where normal movement would be impossible without a severe limp for the next fortnight. I carried this narrative inside me for a very long period, growing up within this strict environment before eventually finding my way out. For those who have experienced a similar sense of isolation or sought to find solidarity in these hidden histories, sharing these reflections helps ensure these voices are finally acknowledged. It is worth considering how many individuals were conditioned to accept marital dynamics that were deeply damaging, yet were labeled as entirely commonplace by the community. Within that culture, the most powerful directives are the ones that are never explicitly voiced. The fundamental expectation dictated that a young woman must remain entirely ignorant of the physical realities of her wedding night, completely lacking the vocabulary or conceptual understanding of her own anatomy. This tradition, inherited from ancestral generations, operated on the premise that possessing knowledge was synonymous with harboring desire, which was inherently linked to transgression. A young woman was expected to approach marriage completely unlearned, an empty vessel to be directed entirely by her husband according to perceived spiritual order. This principle was reinforced through indirect teachings, such as sermons focusing on the vulnerabilities of curiosity, using historical, religious narratives, leaving a young listener to silently process the weight of the message while staring downward. This pervasive rule manifested in everyday life, from the sudden shifts in conversation when an older sibling returned from farm work with flushed cheeks, to the abrupt silence that fell over married women whenever an unwed girl entered the kitchen. Inquiries about a weeping new bride were met with blank, distant stares and immediate deflections to mundane household tasks, teaching young minds exactly what subjects were strictly forbidden long before the actual questions could even be formed. The connection between us reached back to early childhood, as he was the quiet sibling in his family, who quietly tended to his brother's needs without prompting. He had crossed into his early 20s just a week prior to our marriage, celebrated simply with a burnt pastry and light-hearted family jests. Our courtship spanned 3/4 of a year, following a structure entirely foreign to the outside world, defined by sitting on a porch swing with a deliberate distance maintained between us while discussing the autumn harvest. Intimacy was limited to the accidental brushing of hands while exchanging a hymnal during a community gathering, a brief touch that would cause sleepless nights. There was an affection there, rooted in his gentleness toward animals, which within that social framework was considered entirely sufficient for a lifetime commitment. Less than a month before the ceremony, my older sister, who had spent 4 years in marriage and borne 2 children, pulled me into the isolation of the root cellar. Grasping my shoulders in the damp, dark space scented with preserved fruit, she offered a mere handful of words as my entire preparation for what lay ahead, stating simply that it would involve pain, that I must remain absolutely silent, and that time would eventually lessen the difficulty. No further explanation followed as she returned to the main house, leaving me alone on the earthen floor with a sudden, deep sense of dread. Throughout the wedding week, As the women gathered to prepare food and style my hair, I constantly anticipated a deeper explanation, but it never arrived. Even when my mother spent an hour brushing my hair the evening prior, her only commentary was a gentle blessing on my character, leaving me to spend my final night in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, deeply aware that a crucial conversation was being intentionally withheld. The room assigned to us was a small space with a sloping ceiling located at the far end of the upper hallway in his family's residence. A dim kerosene lamp flickered on the washstand, its unclipped wick producing a thin stream of smoke, while a new, heavily starched quilt adorned a bed that seemed impossibly narrow for two people. Through the slightly open window, the distant, muffled voices of the men finishing the evening chores provided a backdrop to the immediate silence inside. Dressed in a long-sleeved cotton nightgown that carried the distinct scent of a storage chest, I sat rigidly on the edge of the mattress with my hands clasped, listening to the rapid pulse in my ears. He entered and remained motionless against the closed door for an extended period, still clad in his formal attire with his suspenders unfastened, repeatedly tugging at his sleeve while avoiding all eye contact. The profound silence stretched between us until he finally spoke my name, his voice trailing off into an unspoken admission of shared bewilderment. It became instantly clear that he was just as uninstructed as I was, having received only brief, inadequate guidance from his father earlier that day. His hands were visibly trembling as he sat beside me on the creaking frame, reaching out with fingers that felt completely cold. He stumbled over fragmented inquiries and expressions of hesitation, and though I wished to offer comfort, my own lack of language made it impossible. In response, I gave a small, uncomprehending nod to an unfinished question, a gesture that would be the closest thing to agreement present in that room. The events that followed lacked any element of gradual tenderness, prolonged not by affection, but by a mutual, profound ignorance of how our bodies were supposed to interact. He was attempting to execute the vague instructions received by the woodpile, while I focused entirely on maintaining the absolute immobility and silence expected of me, causing my physical self to lock shut like a barred barrier, a reaction I had never been warned was even possible. I bit my cheek to the point of drawing blood, fixing my gaze on the ceiling patterns while my thoughts drifted to strange, disconnected observations about the world just to endure the moment. Afterward, he retreated to his side of the bed without speaking, leaving me in the dark to discover that the bleeding was far more severe than my sister's brief warning had suggested. Finding a loose thread on the quilt, I began to pull it continuously, finding a strange sense of composure in unraveling the stitching simply because it was the only element in the room under my direct control. When his quiet weeping began, I reached out to reassure him that everything was fine, assuming the role of comforter despite my own physical trauma. The stark reality was that neither of us understood that physical readiness requires time, that pain serves as a critical warning sign rather than a measure of compliance, or that the experience carried a specific medical definition entirely separate from marital obligation or spiritual duty. The involuntary physical lockdown caused by simultaneous terror and lack of knowledge was a concept completely erased from every sermon and private discussion in our community. It would take more than a decade before a medical professional in an outside clinic would finally speak the actual name of that condition to me, with immense gentleness. He was not a malicious individual, but rather a participant in a generationally enforced system that conditioned women to view their physical selves as sources of danger, and men to view intimacy strictly as an obligation. The burden of this cultural silence was born in darkened bedrooms, across the community, under starched bedding and smoking lamps. The realization that this experience was a common structural reality rather than an isolated misfortune was what ultimately shattered my perception of that life. For 2 full weeks, my movement through the household resembled that of an elderly person, requiring a hand against the wall for balance while stepping with extreme caution. The visiting women from the neighborhood arrived with food and pleasantries, dismissing my obvious physical distress as a completely standard part of early marriage, discussing it with the same casual tone used for seasonal weather. I was instructed in traditional home remedies using warm baths and herbal mixtures, Yet the concept of seeking professional medical attention was never raised by anyone. I adapted by navigating stairs laterally and utilizing kitchen surfaces for physical support, eventually mastering the art of projecting complete normalcy while suppressing internal panic. This method of smiling, serving refreshments, and quietly conditioning oneself to endure internal distress became a vital survival strategy shared by many. Months later, during a communal gathering of younger wives working on a quilt, a minor mishap with a needle prompted a quiet admission of ongoing physical pain from one participant, which was met with another's acknowledgement that her own recovery had taken half a year. The profound silence that followed was broken only by the entry of an older matriarch, instantly closing the window of vulnerability and returning everyone to their repetitive work. The memory of those subtle admissions remained vivid, particularly regarding a peer who, despite already caring for a young child with another expected, carried that familiar blank expression of emotional detachment. She later disclosed in confidence that her initial marital experience had driven her to seek refuge on a bathroom floor because the bed itself felt entirely unsafe, only to be discovered by her mother-in-law, who dismissed her distress with a reminder of her new marital obligations. This dynamic represented the community's self-correcting mechanism, where any individual who neared exposing the truth was immediately silenced by peers to preserve the collective illusion, operating under the fear that a single fracture in the facade could cause their entire social structure to collapse. By the time a few years had passed, these conversations ceased entirely, replaced by avoided gazes. My departure from that world occurred when I was 29, and nearly a year later, I found myself in an outside medical examination room, staring at an anatomical illustration of a woman's body. Experiencing a clearly labeled diagram of my own physical self for the very first time at the age was a profound shock. As the clinician explained the function of specific muscular structures and their involuntary response to deep-seated fear, my hands began to tremble uncontrollably, a reaction that persisted for days. The condition, vaginismus, was an automatic physical response to trauma and apprehension, a recognized medical reality with established treatments rather than a character defect or an expected marital trial. Sitting in my vehicle afterward until the windows obscured my view, the dominant emotion was not fury, but an overwhelming, profound sorrow for the young people we had been, one sitting terrified on the edge of a narrow mattress, the other weeping in confusion. Both of them completely isolated by a systemic lack of language that damaged everyone involved, including the patriarchs tasked with passing down broken directives. When attempting to describe this reality to an acquaintance from the modern world, the profound cultural divide became entirely apparent. Despite her genuine empathy and tears, she could not fathom the total absence of basic communication. Her background provided terminology for every human experience, whereas my origin relied on an enforced quietude for everything, creating a vast distance that cannot be bridged by a simple explanation. This represents the unique isolation of the former member, who permanently carries an internal landscape that remains inaccessible to outsiders. Yet, to remain entirely truthful, one must acknowledge the deep beauty that existed alongside the hardship. The peaceful resonance of horses, exhaling in the early morning chill as the barn doors opened, remains an unmatched memory of tranquility, missed as deeply as the presence of family. The distinct quality of bread baked in a traditional wood-fired oven, with its dark crust and remarkably soft interior, created an aroma that filled a home, a standard that modern appliances fail to replicate. The image of a grandmother's worn hands, marked by decades of labor and holding a thin band of gold, remains etched in my mind, inducing a profound longing for a landscape that simultaneously caused immense pain. Both of these conflicting realities must coexist to fully comprehend the experience. The entire situation can be summarized as systemic control disguised as spiritual devotion, proving that beauty and trauma can reside under the same roof. Refusing to alter this narrative for the comfort of others is a deliberate choice. It is not an exercise in animosity, but an assertion of autonomy. Choosing to walk away, to seek education, and to give voice to the unspoken realities is an act of reclaiming one's history, allowing oneself to retain the cultural music and traditions that belong to the individual rather than the institution. For anyone raised in an environment where their physical self was treated as an inherent danger, or where the reality of their trauma was entirely ignored by the community, it is vital to understand that survival itself is a profound achievement. There is no inherent brokenness in the individual. The fault lay entirely within the system of silence that was imposed from birth. To those who may be processing these words in secret within those communities, or those who have departed, yet still feel the emotional weight of their memories, your experiences are seen and recognized. This applies equally to those contemplating a departure in complete secrecy, those who have spent decades in marriage before finally finding the words to define their past, and anyone who felt a sudden shock of recognition during this narrative. You are completely valid in your journey, and you do not occupy this space alone. If a particular observation or memory from this history touched a hidden part of your own experience, consider exchanging those reflections. There remains a vast reservoir of experiences yet to be articulated regarding the transition, the moment of departure, and the individuals who provided assistance along the way. For those who choose to accompany this ongoing exploration of hidden truths, the invitation to listen and reflect remains continuously open. The physical self was never the source of transgression. The system of enforced silence was the true violation.